How do you grow your business using psychology, and how do you do it and remain ethical? Two of my favourite topics. I'm Anne Miles from Suits and Sneakers, and I'm interviewing today Elena Connolly. Elena is a freelance copywriter that specialises in psychology-based copy. So, how do you make your website perform better with psychology? Where do you start to even start thinking about putting psychology through your copy, and how do you do it and remain ethical? Hi Elena, how are you going?
Good. How are you?
Thanks for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So firstly, I really need to know, what makes good web copy?
That's a big question,
Isn't it?
Big one to start. I think with web copy, I kind of find business owners or brands or kind of you kind of, because you can write, people kind of think, oh, I can write, and you kind of get that first draft out yourself, and quite often you're kind of thinking of it from the business side and not necessarily the consumer side. So great web copy for me is when the reader or the consumer or the target audience, they can see their own voice reflected back in the copy. So it's so tempting to kind of talk about your business and why you're great, and touch on the outcome for the reader as well. But actually, great web copy switches that around, and it's actually kind of the person reading it. All they've got in their head is what's in it for me, and you kind of have to keep answering that question as you're writing. So great web copy is wordsmithing a lot, but I always say it's kind of one part wordsmithing and 9 parts psychology, and just kind of getting into the reader's head, and understanding why they're there, what's going to motivate them to take an action. That action might not necessarily be buying something, it could be just moving them through your funnel or moving them to another part of the web page, whatever the kind of action is. But every web page should have an objective, and your objective for your homepage might just be to get them to read your blog. Your objective for your blog might be to get them to subscribe to a newsletter. A shop page, obviously the objective is usually for buying. So I always think great web copy, you start with your objective, you get into the head of the reader, and how do you want to take them on that journey to the end of the page where you want them to take the action.
So that's super interesting, and it's, for me, there's a whole lot of layers to writing really good copy. And one of the things that I get asked a lot about, because I'm like a real advocate for getting stereotypes out of our copy, and all of our marketing can't bear it, but a lot of times people say to me, well, how can you talk to or be more inclusive of a wider audience but still feel like it's for me as an individual and to target really tightly? So do you believe that it's possible to speak to one person even though you're trying to be inclusive of a wider audience?
I think that it's important that so much is talked about the kind of target audience profile and kind of creating your ideal customer, and you do demographic information for that, and also the psychographic, so what kind of motivates them, what challenges do they have, what barriers might they have for buying. When I write, I always think about one person, and I think as marketing and digital marketing especially has enabled us to be more personalized, the kind of idea of this one size fits all website is maybe being shifted away. And I can see a time in a few years' time when the actual website as we know it is almost redundant. And because we can be so personalized now, and yes, inclusive to everybody, but also very, very personalized to almost down to the one reader, actually you would be able to create microsites or landing pages which are very personalized to the actual pain point of the one reader that you're talking to. And therefore this idea of having one website where you have kind of tailored to a segment but you haven't really personalized down to their personal motivations and goals and kind of barriers to buying. So I think a lot has been said, like I said, about the kind of target audience profiling, segmenting that way. But I think in order to be truly inclusive, we can kind of shift that idea of personalization even further, where we are just tailoring really specific landing pages to specific audiences based on their problems rather than who they are.
Oh, yes, please. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, because if we're worrying about who they are, their age, their generation, gender, all of that, to me, you're potentially wasting a lot of your media money because you're speaking to half the people who don't care about your topic. Yet, if you align with what people care about, then you actually can reach a wider demographic group, but very, very tightly niched group of people who have the same interest. So, that really is awesome. I feel overall for the work that you do, it sounds like there's a little bit of behavioural economics in there. How does that fit for you?
Yeah, I think if we're talking specifically about web copy, a lot of emphasis is placed on the UX and the kind of user experience on the site, and that's kind of the navigational side of the site and where the buttons are placed and what colours those buttons are, and you can kind of take those levels down. For me, obviously, my focus is the copy, and I might be biased, but I believe that is the most important part of the kind of motivational journey to get someone to take an action, just because that's where the emotional trigger is. As we always say, people buy with their heart and then rationalize with their head, and you can only really take someone on that journey through the copy. It's very similar to, copywriters avoid the word sales, but essentially, a copywriter at the end of the day is trying to get someone to take an action or buy or kind of do business with you. And it's the same as a salesperson. So a salesperson wouldn't knock on a door or phone someone up and not they're never going to make a sale unless they're saying the right things, unless they're using the emotional triggers, unless they're kind of taking that person on the journey and letting them see what they need, what their problems might be and how it solves that problem. The copy is that. On a website, the copy is the salesperson talking. So in terms of behavioral economics, for me, that's kind of that pivotal point. And then everything else falls around that, the design of the website, the navigation of the website and the user experience. So yeah, I might be biased, but I feel like that's the key point.
I agree. I feel like it isn't often in the creative brief that what you actually want people to do on a UX point of view. They might say ultimately we want people to buy something, but I don't actually see it in a brief saying which button you've got to push when. And I think in the work that I've seen for good psychology-based copy, there's a click action at different points for different purposes. So it'd be good if it was more aligned. You're making me think that aligning with the user experience the whole way through, and now with technology like Sitecore, which is used to be really it is super expensive tool to make dynamic content come through, like you said before about customizing to the individual. WordPress even now has a way to do dynamic content. So right. I think this is saying now we need to open this up and start talking to the individuals even tighter, like you said. So let's make sure that's in the brief now, that even WordPress websites can have personalization. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. And people are so used to that now. You only have to think something and it shows up on your newsfeed, on your Facebook newsfeed, and you're having a conversation and the next thing you know, it's kind of showing up on an ad is showing up on your Facebook or Instagram. And there's a lot of controversy around that and whether that's ethical, but as it becomes more mainstream, people are so used to their content being highly, highly personalized to the point of what they're actually talking about, wanting to buy, showing up on their feed. So then if they are coming through from an ad to your website, and then there's a massive disconnect in how personalized that content that they saw on their newsfeed was, and then they hit a homepage which is very, very generic. And although you have tried to personalize as much as you can, you're still talking to a very wide number of people. So there is that disconnect there, and the more we can close that gap, the better that user experience is, and the better that person feels like they're to be taking on a journey that they understand and that is kind of familiar to them.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's awesome. And tell me, who's been a good inspiration to you to learn all of this?
I kind of always had a very a deep fascination maybe in psychology, and that's kind of what my degree is. I did psychology and public relations as a kind of weird mesh. And I remember my mum being like, I don't know if there's any jobs where you can combine those two skills. So psychology was always massive for me. That's just kind of something that's just innate. And in terms of the copywriting side, there are so many people putting out great content. In terms of if someone wanted to learn the science of copywriting, I would say Copy Hackers is like the kind of gurus for me. Joanna Weeb, who does a lot of talking about copy, and kind of her knowledge of psychology and her knowledge of consumer behavior and behavioral economics is just unbelievable. So the kind of science side, I always say there's a science and an art to it. There's kind of, you can learn the formulas, you know, on a web page, we write to a formula, we start with our problem, we aggravate the problem, we talk about the solution, we talk about the outcome, and that's the kind of formula that you can follow that kind of will set up your intro paragraph on your web page. But then there's always the art side as well, which is kind of the bit that you just need that creative mind in order to connect what the reader wants with maybe an anecdotal story or kind of something you've picked up in the environment that you can like kind of weave into your copy. So that's the kind of art side. So many influences, definitely psychology, and definitely for a science copywriting perspective would be Copy Hackers and Joanna Weeb. She's amazing.
I think also one of the people that I found an inspiration for me when I started to get involved in this, and it's, you know, pretty simple level, but Cialdini with his laws of motivation. I feel like that's a good place to start as well. And it talks about law of contrast, law of new. What are the other ones? I'm struggling to think of them at the moment, but sort of like where FOMO came from, the fear of missing out, social proof, you know, some of those things. I think they're good, like real basics, aren't they? Because you know, I've got books on consumer psychology, you know, this fat, which it's not everyone's cup of tea, and it's pretty dry, isn't it? And the psychology degree is not something everybody's going to want to go and do to become better. But I definitely think there's some tricks. Also, NLP meta programs. I'm trying to think of the other modalities. Like definitely NLP has a lot of other really good, like learning about linguistics, even nominalizations, which is how what levels of hierarchy different words have, and sort of the more global they are, the more they get into your emotion. I find that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. There's little words that seem so obvious. So everybody kind of thinks, oh, if you've put free or new in something, especially email subject lines, that's motivating for people. But there's also strange ones, kind of like get. People love the word get. So if you were to write in your call to action, you know, get my ebook, people are so motivated by that word, and it's studies have shown that time and time again, that word get, and also the word because. Because is the ultimate, isn't it? I think from the book, I think he mentions it in the book we were just talking about, where they had people queuing up to do photocopies, and they had their person try and cut in line. So he would try and cut in and say, is it all right if I cut in? Because and he'd just say, can I try and, you know, can I go ahead of you? 70% of the time people said no. But the guy tried again, and it was, can I cut in front of you because I need to make some copies? A massive proportion of people let that person cut in, even though the reason was nonsensical. Everybody needed to make copies, but just justifying it with that because instantly triggers something where in the brain where people are like, yeah, you can. You've given me a reason, and you've used that word because, which is kind of fascinating, because the reason he had was just like ridiculous. Everybody needed to make copies, but you know, knowing those little tricks and putting that into your copy, it's subliminal. It's kind of not something that people are going to read and think, oh, they're trying to play a mind trick on me, but it does trigger something and inspires an action, which is what you want to do at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is starting to touch on something that I care greatly about, is the ethics of this. So what's your position on this?
Look, I always say that copywriting is inspiring someone to take an action. So you're not persuading them. And I know that word persuasion comes up a lot, and you know, I use it myself, and it's kind of the default when you're talking about copy, but actually I quite prefer to use the word inspire. I think what we're not trying to sell something to someone that they don't want. We're trying to inspire them to understand we can solve a problem that they might not know they have yet. They might not know they have that problem yet, but the copy is to kind of show them that they do have the problem and inspire them if they need a solution to take that action. If they don't need that solution, no copy is going to change their mind. You know, if I was to go on a kind of, I don't know, AFL website or get served an AFL and someone's trying to sell me a kit, I don't have that problem. I don't want that solution. It doesn't interest me. And so the copy is never going to make me do something I don't want to do. It inspires you, but it doesn't necessarily make you do anything. So I think that's how I try and look at it from an ethical point of view. And, you know, I'm not in the business of trying to take people's money. It's just kind of making their life easier by showing them what they might need.
I think that's a fair way to look at it. I also think if you're selling an ethical product and a product that genuinely is going to make a difference in people's world in a good way, then helping them better see that fits for them, I think that's doing a good thing in the world. So I don't mind too much about that, but I definitely have seen these techniques, you know, really motivating people in a not so ethical way as well. So it's sort of like, you know, you can have a sword and you can do a dance demonstration that's amazing, or you can stab somebody. So it's not ethical, it's your motivation. And
absolutely.
Don't you
it's
think?
Funny, actually, I was listening to a podcast with Tarzan Kay, who's quite a well-known email copywriter. If anyone should subscribe to her email list, she sends out amazing, funny, highly engaging emails. But she was talking about, she does a lot of launches, so she'll kind of be affiliated with someone else who's doing a launch, say it's a new digital course or whatever, and she'll send emails out to her email list. And she said in the meeting, they said to them, pretend it's finishing at midnight, pretend the offer's finishing at midnight, and then the next day send an email to say, oh, we've expanded it because blah, 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 or like there was too many people that wanted it, so we've extended it for another day, which was the plan all along. But they want people, they were trying to get people to buy it by using kind of vaguely shady techniques. And she just said no. And she said other copywriters within the circle who were affiliated as well did it, and she got their emails and she saw that they'd done it, and she was just kind of like, that's not how I want to run my business. So people might think that's ethical. So the boundaries are obviously very blurred. What one person thinks is ethical, another might not be. But like you said, it's just the power is in your hands. You've got the weapon and you can use it however you want, for good or for bad. And that's true of anything in life, I suppose.
Definitely. You also have talked before about Jonah Berger's book, Contagious. And, you know, and he's talked about actually infiltrating your life with, marketing. How does that fit, like from an ethical standpoint, but generally with behavioural psychology?
Yeah, so his book, Contagious, I actually read it for the first time last year, and it was like phenomenal for me. It really changed the way I think. You know, one of the things he says is to just kind of, in order to get your brand talked about, in order to get people passing the information on, because at the end of the day, word of mouth will trump anything, any ad, any kind of marketing that you do. If you can get people talking to each other about your brand or your business, that word of mouth is going to trump anything. I think 90% word of mouth has got a 90% success rate over kind of everything else. So he kind of says the best way to do it is to infiltrate your brand in people's lives, so they kind of have to talk about it. And you can do that by, there's lots of ways to do that. If you own an e-commerce store, say a jewelry brand, you know, someone walking around wearing your jewelry is a talk trigger. And that, so, but for service-based businesses and businesses that don't have that luxury of someone wearing something that they can talk about, there are other ways to do it. So one way that I use quite often is to associate your brand with a word. So if you want your business or yourself, even if you're a personal brand, or you're kind of, you want to try and be associated with a word, and you use this word in your copy, use it when you describe your business. And eventually, if you're doing it enough, and you'll be thinking, oh my God, I use this word all the time, I can't use it anymore. People aren't noticing it. But once they do start noticing it and they hear that word, your brand is triggered in their head, and they kind of will even start repeating it back. So a good example is Coca-Cola, who massively associate themselves with summer, with good times. And they might, now their brand is so established, they don't have to use these kind of triggers. It's just in people's heads already. But they spent decades building that up and associating it with people. And even down to the alcohol, Coca-Cola and being a mixer for alcohol, it's kind of like you would never walk into a bar and say, I'll have a vodka and Pepsi. They've just associated themselves, aligned themselves so deeply with that. And it's not something that they kind of talk a lot about, but it's just in your head. And even people like Gary Vaynerchuk, I can never say his surname, Gary V, he just used the word hustle all the time. Every time he talks about himself, every time he talks about his kind of process, every time he's trying to motivate people, he's using the word hustle. And now, as soon as you hear the word hustle, you think of Gary V. And it's so powerful and strong. And you might think, oh, but these are massive brands and businesses, but you can do it yourself. You know, I use the word power a lot in my copy. So I have a package that I call the Power Copy Package. I call my process Power Copy, which involves the psychology and the wordsmithing and that kind of 3-step process I call Power Copy. And I just use that word a lot. And, you know, eventually, hopefully, kind of people will start associating, not necessarily every time they hear the word power, but subliminally in their head, they think her copy's powerful. And that's kind of how I'm trying to associate that word to be synonymous with me.
Another aspect of NLP particularly, but it's probably something you automatically do, is each person has a different mode of thinking. It's a different thinking style. So it can be visual, it can be auditory, it can be sensory, it can be action doing. How do you incorporate that kind of experiential nature into your copy?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That is a tricky one. It's kind of hard when we're talking about web copy, because, like we said earlier, although you are segmenting, it needs to be fairly generic and kind of answer everybody's problems. I think when you're talking more about content that drives to your website, you can probably think a little bit more about that kind of thing. So in your blog copy, for example, or your podcast or something, you know, because you've got a bit more transient nature of content rather than copy, you can kind of weave in all those elements that might motivate somebody, and, you know, through visual or audio. You know, you might do a podcast because, you know, a large segment of your audience are quite audio learners, or you might do blogs or videos because, you know, people respond visually. So I think I personally would use content to kind of include everybody's different learning styles. And then when it comes to web copy, you kind of need to try and please everybody in a way as much as you can. So yeah, I would do it that way. It's very hard within web copy to try and, you'll end up confusing people. And, you know, the famous saying is kind of, don't try and please everyone because you won't please anyone. You try and be everything to everybody. So yeah, my advice there would be to use your content to kind of try and include everybody's different learning styles. And then maybe for your web copy, just kind of either pick the one that you think is most relevant to your audience, and you can do research to find that out, or just try and kind of be a little bit more inclusive of everybody that way.
I think one of the things that might add to what you're saying, and I agree with everything you said, I think that's really smart. The majority of people tend to think visually. So even you can put choices of words into your copy that are aligned with that style. So you could say, you know, come and see us. That's different than come and talk to us.
Right.
So if you put those sorts of words, I've got a little chart I should make available for everybody as well. But so if you put it into the order of preference, so to be V, A, and K. So V would be the visual, A, auditory, and then K, kinesthetic, which is get people to do something. Right. So I've noticed that you're very focused on making the web copy work from a behavioural economics perspective. I think that's very good for that kinesthetic people. They want to have the action and the thing to do.
Yeah, that's very true. And there's also, you know, the way that you describe things. So, for example, they talk a lot in Copy Hackers about adding texture to your writing. So the adjectives you use, the kind of, if you're describing, I don't know, like kind of an old person's hands, for example, you'd kind of say leathery, and that using those adjectives that are more descriptive and kind of, or using words that invoke smell within your copy is a way of doing that as well. And using colours, like writing colours. So, for example, if you're talking about someone being new to something and you say they're very green, that's a really strong visual cue for people. And so weaving that kind of texture into your copy is a way to kind of help with that visual side of things.
I think that's, awesome, really good advice. So when you're talking about behavioural economics, things like, is there a certain way people read on the page that you write for?
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of get down to the kind of basic, I suppose, the science side of it. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the science and the art. So people read web pages in an F pattern. So you imagine they read the top all the way along, and then they read the next sentence, and then they're kind of going down. So that when they're scanning, so the first thing someone will do when they hit your web page is scan it, decide if it's worth their full attention. If it's not, they're bouncing off. If it is, then they'll read it properly. So you need to get that F pattern correct for the scanners. So it kind of means you put your meaty words on the left-hand side. So if you are structuring your sentences, you know, kind of, if you've got a word that you think is really powerful, that you want somebody to be synonymous with your business, or that you think is really going to resonate with them, drop it down to the next line. If it's sat on the line on the right-hand side, drop it down to the left. And the same with headings. If they're over 2 lines, pick that word that starts the second line really carefully if you can. I mean, there's some kind of aesthetics that come into play, of course. But yeah, the F pattern is a really good one to remember. Keep your kind of, the first 2 or 3 sentences need to really pull them in. That's where they're going to scan the most, down the left-hand side of the page. And then, so you kind of think like that. Other ones are using binary choice in your call to action. So you'll see this quite often. People make decisions with binary choice. People like to know this or this, yes or no, one or the other. If it gets any more than that, it gets confusing, and the decision making, they can kind of put the decision making process off. So quite often someone will use a call to action button, which is just one choice. If people have the choice to take an action or get let off the hook and think about it later, they'll just probably decide not to. Whereas if you give them binary choice and say, either do this action or do this one, that third do nothing, they don't want to think about the third do nothing because that's too much. It's kind of, all right, well, okay, so I'll subscribe to the blog, or I'll book in a call. Those are my 2 binary choices, so I'll choose one or the other. So that's a really clever little way of getting people to take an action you want them to take and not defer it to later, because quite often if they defer the decision to later, they won't come back. So that's another little trick, which is kind of from the science side of copywriting.
It sounds to me like that person's been a parent. It's like when you've got children and, you know, making a decision and getting dressed, you want them to feel like they're empowered, but really just get on with the getting dressed. You want this one or this one today? Exactly. And they don't realise there's a whole cupboard full of, you know, of the horrible ballet dress with the, you know, motorcycle helmet, you know, the really good combination. You know?
It's either this one or this one. You've got no other choice.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing I've noticed is a little contentious in psychology writing is, do you like stack the pain, or do you put a
yeah,
positive goal
yeah.
out there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about the PASO technique, which is problem, aggravation, solution, outcome. So PASO, that's kind of how I would start a web page. And the reason we start with the problem first is called the framing effect. So people are much more motivated to avoid pain than they are to gain a benefit. So, and this doesn't work every time. And look, you know, if everything was cookie cutter, then we would be out of a job. So I'm not saying every single time this has to be the way it is. Sometimes you need to grab their attention, so you'd use an attention statement first. But 9 times out of 10, problem works first because people are motivated to avoid the pain. So if they hit a web page and the first thing they see is the problem they have in their head reflected on that web page, and then aggravated, so kind of poke it a little bit. You know, an example would be for, say, Weight Watchers. So they might start with, you know, put on a few COVID kilos problem. That person in their head is like, yes, I did. They aggravate that problem by like, and summer's on its way. You're going to have to wear a bikini. Aggravated the problem. And then you go into the solution is, we've got, you know, join Weight Watchers and blah, blah, blah. And then the outcome is feel great on the beach on Christmas Day. So you can see how that would work as an intro paragraph. Maybe not for a website if it's too topical. You don't want to be so kind of framed into a season or whatever. But, you know, starting with that problem will always hook people in more than starting with the solution. So that's kind of why we do it that way. And it's called the framing effect. So kind of problem, solution, problem, solution. And that's a kind of good storytelling technique for the whole way down your web page. You kind of want to take people up and down on a journey of highs and lows and kind of, oh no, oh yeah. So they're kind of nodding their head, they're smiling, they're, you know, so that's kind of the storytelling aspect that is so popular, it's such a buzzword, but that's how you do that, you know, take people on highs and lows.
I like that though, because it's not just all stacking the pain, which some people can be tempted. I think your model has, the positive outlook for those that are inspired by that. It covers both. I think in NLP terms, this would be a meta program, whether you move away from something or whether you move towards something.
Absolutely, yeah, the motivation, and we that knowing that motivation is really, really powerful, and that can quite often, we're kind of moving away from the web copy side of things, but people are motivated either by a goal that's in the distance or by moving away from a pain point they have. And at some point, especially if we go back to the weight loss thing, they're motivated because they've got a pain point where they want to lose weight. As they move away from that pain point, that motivation diminishes because they no longer they're losing weight, they don't have that massive pain. And then you have to shift your motivation to the point they want to get to. So as you shift away from the pain, you want to then change that motivation to be whatever their end goal is. So, you know, it's important to kind of, bear that in mind, how people are motivated, and that your copy is always going to need to be fluid and change. But I really like that kind of the psychology behind what motivates people.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, me too. And I love your model. I think it really does that really well and gets around that problem. The other thing I love about it is the outcome-based in life coaching. This is called future pacing. So you would set a future that gets people motivated to change as well. And they can see themselves in the future. So I love that model. So I've written it down even, problem, aggravate, solution, outcome. I think anyone could put that in, you know, just ordinary copy at the moment, really.
And when you've got that blank page syndrome where you're just kind of like, I don't know how to start, that technique is the perfect way to start. You always, you know, it just gets rid of that intro paragraph, which can quite often be the reason people struggle. It's like sat there looking at the blank page, but use that little technique. You know what the problem is, you know, you can aggravate, you know what your solution is and the outcome, and you've started. And that's kind of 9 times out of 10 the problem. But going back to the future pacing, a little technique actually for future pacing in copy is that quite often people will talk about this kind of massive aspirational outcome. And I think that works well maybe for an intro paragraph, but when you're near your call to action and you're actually trying to get people to click that button, future pacing, it's important to keep the outcome. I think the science is under 90 days. So what's the really small win they'll get? You know, if they click that button, what's that really small win? They'll tick something off their to-do list. They, you know, something that is going to make them think, oh yeah, that's great. Whereas an aspirational outcome that's 2 years in the future is great for your kind of overarching message, but it's not necessarily useful for someone to just get them to kind of take that small next step. So when you're future pacing, it's important to think about the smaller wins as well, and make sure you put the smaller wins into your copy and not just these kind of massive outcomes and massive transformations.
That's super good advice. So with some of the work and study I've done, you can actually write for different personality types, and even casting and photography and everything can be done around personality type as well. Some of the more successful Hollywood movies and TV shows, like even just off the top of my head, Sex and the City or Toy Story and what's the one with the donkey? Oh, Shrek. They've actually cast the lead, 4 main lead talent on the 4 main personality types of DISC, DISC. Okay. So one of the really fascinating things, each of those personality types have like a certain thing they need, and there's a writing framework. Actually, even at the bottom of the Suits and Sneakers website, there's a worksheet on this called Format, number 4 MAT. And I like the version from this woman called Bernice McCarthy. She did that in 84 to help students in education to engage more, learn, want to learn, and retain and act on what they wrote. And I'm going, yeah, we should put this into copy. But one of the fascinating things that I'm wondering in particular for you and the style of work that you do is, how do you handle the objections from that personality type that's nitpicky and looking, every time they read everything that you're doing, they're looking for what is wrong with this brand or this product. Do you have a technique of how you answer those what ifs and the negative inquiry?
Look, actually, the way I always tackle websites or web pages is that people are looking for an excuse to say no. So people don't want to part with their money. People don't want to do something that they are going to regret, whether it's signing up to a newsletter and getting spammed or something bigger, like, you know, paying thousands of dollars for something and not getting what they thought they were going to get. So people are looking for a reason to say no, and you just kind of have to answer their barriers as you go through. There's a little technique that I use called, there's different variants, but it's called the even if technique. So when I'm in research phase, I will do a lot of desktop research on the target audience. So I'll kind of, it works particularly well for B2C. There are different ways to do it for B2B, but I'll kind of concentrate on B2C because it's the easier way to do it. So you know, you go on Amazon, you look at the top 10 books in the industry you're writing about, you go on Amazon and you read the reviews that people have left on that book, because quite often they'll talk about their pain points and the barriers they have to that kind of industry there. Or I join Facebook groups, I join LinkedIn groups, I join forums, anywhere where people are having a conversation about the industry or the problem that you're writing about. And then I'll list out all the barriers they have. So what would turn them off from buying it? What has turned them off in the past? And then you can kind of use the even if technique on your webpage. It works for the bottom of the home page. It works quite well on your about page actually as well. So you can kind of talk around it, and then you'd say, this solution is for you, even if you blah, 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 blah. So you then list out what's in their head as a barrier. So you kind of like, so for example, on mine, I know my barriers might be, I've paid for a copywriter before and I didn't get the ROI, you know, and there's lots of different barriers people might have. Or my business is really niche. I bet you wouldn't be able to write about everyone thinks their business is very different to the norm, and it's true, every business is different, but there's also a way to write for everyone. So I know what those barriers are. So on my website, I've got kind of like, power copy is for you, even if you've used a copywriter before and you weren't thrilled with the results. My technique is this. So I'll then say their objection, and I'll counteract it with a why you don't have to have that objection anymore. So, and it can just be a bullet point, 2 or 3 or 3 or 4, however many objections, depending on the size of what you're asking them to do, would be how big their objections are. But it all comes back to that research phase, knowing your audience, knowing what their objections are, using the objections in their own words. It's important not to turn it into your own language. Obviously, you have to use your own tone of voice, but if they use a particular word, like quite often people don't use the word copy for what I do, that's not a word that they know of, but they know of, wordsmithing, or they know of content. Quite often they use the word content. So I'll reflect the language that I found when I was doing my research on the web page so they can read it back. So in terms of the people that are saying no and looking for a reason to say no, that's 90% of the people that are on your website. So knowing what those objections are that are in their head and reflecting it back in your copy and why you're counteracting that objection, that's the way to get around that one, I would say.
Yeah, even the fact that you're considering it, I think a lot of other people are not. That's what I love about writing with psychology in your background. I think it's almost a must, truthfully. And you touched on some interesting things about where you get research, and wondering if data is something that falls into your work. How does data sit for you?
It hasn't so far. I think it hasn't so far. It's not something when I do my research, I kind of I'll look at kind of studies that have been done and use it from that point. Obviously, I'll use data from the website analytics side. So whenever I start a project, I will always ask, what's your most visited web page? How long are people on that page? If we can use heat mapping to see where people are hanging around on pages more than others. So I'll use the kind of data analytics from the website side of things as a kind of framework to know because quite more often than not, people now have a website. So what we're doing is actually making what they've got better. So if you can understand what they've got right now, what's working and what's not, and use that data to your advantage when you're refreshing, then I'd use it from that point. Generally, the research I do is very much more around desktop research, around how people are saying things and the words and phrases they're using, more than the data points. That makes sense.
That's fascinating. I think that's probably more than I've never had any copywriter before ask me, can we get the Google Analytics? So I think good for you. That's another whole level what you're doing there.
Yeah, no, it's vital.
So tell me, if people want to learn more about this and more about you, where's a good place to find you? Yeah,
so my business is called 23 Wise Words. So I'm at 23wisewords.com. I'm on Instagram at 23 Wise Words. I'm on Facebook at 23 Wise Words. I also have a YouTube channel, 23 Wise Words, surprisingly.
Yes.
Where I record copy tips and I share that on the channel. And then everything's copy tips. So on my Instagram, it's copy tips. All over the web at 23 Wise Words. And I'm quite lucky no one else uses that name, so I was like, I could get all the handles, all the URLs.
So the very last question for you is there psychology behind the 23 words, and what are they? Like, how did that come about?
Do you know, I get asked that question a lot. I did have, when I first started my business, I wanted Wise Words. That domain was taken. I had a mission statement at the time. It's changed now, and it was 23 words. But honestly, the real reason is it's my son's birthday. I was just like, I wanted Wise Words. I read somewhere that having a number can help with memory retention. My son's born on the 23rd of August. I was like, I like 23 Wise Words.
Yes.
And I had that mission statement, which I kind of engineered to be 23, so I knew if someone asked. I kind of knew what it was, but that's it. But I've since learned that the number 23 is just like in like kind of folklore. It's actually a really poignant number. Oh. It's like, so a male and a female both contribute 23 chromosomes to create human life. Michael Jordan wore 23 the whole through his career because he believed it was it brought him luck. And then there's like other sides of it where the date of 9/11 added up to 23. So 9/11, 2002, the time the Hiroshima bomb was dropped that time adds up to 23, which are kind of bad connotations, but there's a whole article of all this stuff that was 23, and I was like, wow, like that's amazing. But I'd like to say that was the reason, but
I'm thinking I should start a company with 79 wise words, because I believe when you get into number psychology that 7s and 9s outperform any other number. So maybe I'll compete with you. We'll start the sequel business of 79 or 97 or something.
Yeah, well, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Look, thanks so much, Elena. That's actually really helpful. And I reckon today there's a bunch of stuff that any ordinary writer can take on, and even any brand can actually start requesting more of this kind of thinking in their work. So thanks so much for sharing. It's really appreciated.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Thank you.